What are the common characteristics of a transporter and a Karen? Is it them feeling relatively deprived from something which they believe to be entitled to? Is it having the authoritative personality syndrome? Or is it having a big fat prejudice against everything? Well, you guessed it right. After observing Karens for a long time, you realize they all have one thing in common, which is being prejudiced. Now, we can't really blame them because we are all hella prejudiced as well. Prejudice is a big ass problem where each human tends to make crap up in their mind about someone else's personality completely, stereotyping someone so hard that you imagine that they probably don't put the toilet seat up when they piss. So, why are we always prejudiced even if we try hard not being the next asshole who ends up on our cringetopia? But if we try prowling around a little bit, then we might be able to get some hints over why we act in such a manner. To start, we shall roam the world known as implicit bias and its connection to explaining why we assume everything without knowing anything. By evaluating the behavior and judgment through implicit measures consist of anything which is not direct. Suppose I can ask you, what do you think about the Paul brothers? Well, if you answered that they lack a few brain cells, then that's an explicit measure, because you knew your statement was being assessed by the questioner. An implicit measure needs to be carried out without the person in the test really knowing about it. To understand the nature of implicit bias and prejudice, their metaphysics would be divided into 4 parts, which are attitude, beliefs, traits, and situations. Attitude can be seen differently in aspects of philosophy and psychology. When we consider an attitude in the realm of psychology, it is divided again into explicit attitude and implicit attitude. Now, if we go back to the question about Paul brothers, it is likely you wouldn't want to verbally say such a negative statement that they lack a few brain cells, but implicitly it might be the case that you may think in such a manner, but are not willing to report such a statement. But it also could be that you're unaware of this implicit attitude and only come to the realization after taking a psychological test. This might be one reason to why we develop unconscious prejudices without actual realizations. If philosophically analyzed, we can bring in the pragmatist, even though it always reminds me of the UK's Conservative Party. If humans are seen as a pragmatic being, then it can be said that they develop and update their attitudes with each experiences. So over the years, we can have multiple word clusters associated to different objects, such as McDonald's chicken nuggets are boneless, tasteless, and chickenless. Because you experienced these characteristics in the past, thus now you have formed an attitude towards it. Now coming towards beliefs, under this umbrella we have a theory called contradictory belief, which says when holding an explicit and implicit measures, they tend to tell us about what a person believes, but the same person can behave differently under a different situation because of their different beliefs. That's a lot of difference. Although, what this theory comes to is that one cannot behave differently than one believes. If I don't like McDonald's chicken nuggets and explicitly say that I don't like them, but keep on eating them every day, then my behavior is not in line with what I say, so it could be that unconsciously I'm just a simp for McDonald's. So to understand the prejudice, we need to understand our behavioral development. Let's shake things up a little with Spinoza in order to talk about what one tends to behave under the Spinozan belief fixation. This belief fixation originates from the rejection of will as the cause of free action. This links to belief in a way that one cannot really create a belief without instantly believing what the belief is made of. Suppose I believe Earth is flat, but I cannot believe this without instantly not believing that Earth is not flat. It does not even need logic and clarification in order for me to believe. I can avoid all barriers or logic and do everything in my head to make it possible that Earth is flat. Maybe Earth is just made of flat Earth jointed together to form a sphere world. It is similar to how integration works, where we divide the object into infinitesimally small strips to calculate the area. Oh, by the way, I only say smart words to distract people from the fact that I actually don't know anything about maths and believe Earth is flat. In order to reject a belief, one must already believe in it. Now try to wrap your head around that sucker. When talking about traits, they are also applied in philosophy and psychology in different manners. In psychology, it is viewed as something that remains persistent and consistent over a long time period, while something which is more dynamic and could be altered is called a state. We were before talking about Karen and how they have a trait to consistently think that they are entitled to almost everything, including the decision of getting you fired. Now, if they change their mind every now and then about not calling the manager, well, this is a state because there are changes in their behavior. In testing, it is usually seen that the implicit measures are more like state while the explicit measures are more like trait. It could be that in order to stay apparently consistent and in line with the meta, we end up showing consistency, but in our unconscious mind we might still have hints of prejudice, which only can leak in testing or unintended situations. In philosophy, traits are considered dispositions of our mind. It being an anti-representational theory goes against that one does not act accordingly to how one's mind is made, but the tendencies one tend to have. Traits can be a tendency of the mind through common sense instead of the wiring of one's head. But then the problem arises if one is prejudiced through its own tendency, then how can this tendency be led by common sense if the prejudice itself is wrong? In that case, is common sense usually wrong? Well, that's a question for another video. But there still remains issues with dispositionalism in the philosophy of mind, as they are more generalized, thus cannot be used in primary causes of behavior and judgment, which includes prejudice. Another set of things which are thought to arise bias in people is not the behavior or certain characteristic, but the situation itself. It is said that it is not an attribute of an individual, but an attribute of the situation. This theory has gained more popularity after the paper called A History of Implicit Social Cognition was released. The model used in the paper was the bias of crowd. I mean, we have always come across the crowd in the sense of herding, and that where the crowd walks, I walk. One example given in the paper is of the baseball wave, where everyone tends to wave regardless of how they feel about the wave. I could say, oh shit, I'm too lazy to move my arms, plus doing the wave is useless anyways, but still end up moving my arms without thinking about the wave. If I may, I would give a similar example of mine. As in, on Reddit, a meme gets popular and you think it is a bad meme, because it does not make sense. But the next moment you post this meme on your Reddit because everyone seems to like it. Apparently, that is. This approach to building of prejudice and bias is hard to prove, even though it is explained that a biased thought could be activated through being in a certain situation. But how the situation flips the bias switch in us is still unexplained. Epistemology of Implicit Bias and Prejudice asks following questions. Whether do we even know that we are biased as fuck? And secondly, do we become skeptical of that our beliefs are kinda not as perfect as we think? So we should stop being a little too narcissistic. So are we unconscious when acting like the prejudiced little bitch? Well, hard to answer, but doable kind of. Thing is, we need to specify what are we unaware of. It could be that we are unaware of our mental state or how we represent what's in our mind or the source of the bias itself. We might be able to be conscious of the bias in few situations under different factors. Using Gronsky's discussion about that people cannot be aware of the origin of the bias but can know what the bias consists of. The bogus pipeline experiments were used to confirm the fact that people are conscious of their biased views, as experimenters usually tell participants that they can tell when a participant is faking the explicit report. The results being that the implicit reports through a polygraph outputted a result which was more consistent with the self-reports, ending up showing that people are aware of the content. Again, where there is evidence, there is even more flipping questions. I mean, let's think in this way. If I am sexist, just like the boys at my high school used to be, then do I know that I am sexist through analyzing my behavior and realizing that I'm an asshole? Well, to be honest, I can be wrong because my self-analysis could always be wrong and I could be just too awkward to deal with girls. Well, I still don't know about whether we are aware of our biases or not, but what I know is that you can always press subscribe. So you have implicit bias and prejudice due to that, but you also believe that you are the only right person in the room. Now, if you know that you have an innate prejudice which you cannot detect, then how could you be so sure about your belief? Or maybe you start questioning about whether humans are really the epistemic and self-aware creatures we think we are. My, having an existential crisis, are we? Well, something relevant we can talk about is the recent police abuse and violence against black people that have come to light, especially after George Floyd's death. It was a horrible act, but it also has its explanation. I mean, of course this directly relates to prejudice, but how it relates to it is the question. An experiment covered by Payne 2001 showed pictures of white and black faces. The participant identified the guns in the picture quicker when they were shown black faces, and few participants even mistakenly identified normal tools as guns. The experiment tends to show that error in perception creates implicit bias, thus prejudice and belief formation. This can also be an example of cognitive penetration, where our experiences are influenced by the brain in a wrong fashion, which may even hardwire this belief through a vicious circle of reinforcements. But to make it clear, it is not the face of a black man that causes tools to turn into guns, but rather, as explained, it is a cognitive issue where one might feel certain anxiousness, which leads to a perceptual bypass. Yeah, we call ourselves Homo sapiens sapien, but why do we need two sapiens? Oh, because we are dumb. Did that statement make any sense? Exactly. So what now? If we are implicitly biased and prejudiced in such a manner, where our perceptual capabilities fail to lead us properly, then it is skepticism time, boys. Actually, being skeptical about external world is pretty extreme, to be honest. Because if one starts to question their own perception, then what comes next is an existential crisis, and then watching videos of Mistyverse. But seriously, this is a big issue because it would tend to degrade of how we make decisions and question every single action we take. Well, the only way to solve this problem is to make decisions based on the statistical probability. Oh yes, how much kilograms of sugar do I need to keep myself safe from my next depression? But in the reality, who the fuck cares about cognitive penetration and perceptual bypass, because no one knows or are willing to accept that they are prejudiced. I'ma stop being salty of how idiotic human race is and rather go through a few experiments and theories to investigate the causes of prejudice further. If we look at the prejudice through experimental lens, then we can come across a theory called realistic conflict theory. The theory explains how hostility can arise between two groups which compete over limited resources. These resources usually include money, political power, military protection, or social status. Especially when the game is zero-sum game where loss of one group is balanced out by the gain of another group. The founder of this theory, Donald Campbell, came with this idea after criticizing other psychologists who simplified human behavior over hedonistic desires, such as food, sex, pain avoidance, and some bubble tea. In this theory, he emphasized the impact of incompatible social goals of each group conflicts, and competition over scarce resources. The implementation of realistic conflict theory showed that why people have prejudices against other groups. As in 1970s, data collected from the Michigan National Election Studies showed that the people held negative views against school districts' attempt to integrate school racially. Now this is a racial prejudice or racism in other words, but why this happens is simple. In this example, it is seen that one group of people fear that if there is an integration of educational system, then their children's education quality would be affected, because then resources will be needed to be shared. Thus we come back to the theory. This theory just highlights that we just are as childish and selfish even when we're grown as adults. Oh, he took my pencil. Shut the fuck up. We don't realize every group has the same right as other over the resources on this earth and end up making prejudices in our mind to justify why they don't have any right. Well, we could further clear it out why being in groups makes prejudice. It is not just a conflict over the resources, but just being in a group generally. An experimental group from the Yale University went to the island of Puerto Rico to find some rhesus monkeys. Now you ask me why these monkeys are in any form relevant to the problem of prejudice. Well, you see, we were once monkeys. Okay, not exactly, but we were apes, which are kinda close to monkeys. Okay, shh, you don't argue with me. Anyhow, these monkeys were separated into two groups. One of the monkeys was the outsiders who had recently left the group, while the second group consisted of insiders who had recently joined the group of monkeys. The special thing to note here was that the monkeys who had just left the group had been part of the group since they were born, and had left the childhood group once reaching the reproductive age. Well, that's what we try to do as well, but end up failing and becoming an incel. So the outsiders still had the familiar faces in contrast to the insiders who joined recently. The monkeys who were from the childhood group were shown a picture of an insider and an outsider monkey. The results were that the monkeys who were shown the picture stayed at the picture of the outsider monkeys for longer, suggesting the wariness of outsiders. Oh, I hear you. I hear your argument the monkeys in this case might just be curious about the outsiders, right? But this area of possibility was ruled out when further experimentation was performed. This included the test called Implicit Association Test. This test is a computer-based test where implicit bias is calculated through over association of good or bad with something. For example, it could be that Trump's face is associated with bad, quicker than the orange being associated with bad. Oh wait, they both are the same thing. Going back to the experimentation. The monkeys were then shown paired up pictures of fruit and spiders. The association of spiders with outsiders and fruit with insiders made the monkeys bored quickly. But when they were shown the reverse, as in the spider being linked with the insider and fruit with the outsider, then things got more interesting. Now I can't convince you, non-evolutionary believers, or let me refer to you as the people living in the 19th century, that the link between the monkeys and us shows one fact, that this phenomena of the prejudice is not just born out of those fishy social media posts that your mother-in-law has followed, but is actually born out of the group behavior. In this group behavior, we feel comfortable with our own people and can't relate to an outsider, thus forming a bias which might even be unconscious. But oh wait, monkey is no human, monkey no smarty pants, or capable of complex thought process? Yeah, the above behavior was random, is it now? What we can conclude is that this experiment shows a prehistoric origin of our prejudice with our ancestors. Because if you think about it, any animal including us would feel endangered when not being with a kind of its own. Similarly, in old times when we roamed naked, we tried to survive in groups as it was easier to find a mate, food and shelter in that group. So then it is obvious that some outsider's interference would threaten the constant survival of the group. So to protect ourselves from the outsiders, we developed an instinct to see who is part of our group and who is not, which slowly slid away in our unconscious minds where it still exists. Now, this does not, of course, justify the prejudice we hold against certain groups of people or anything we come across, but provides us with that prejudice is not intentional. But let's not completely write this reasoning. Instead, let's write the ethics of this topic instead. So we have talked about implicit bias and prejudice, how they are caused and how they affect us. But isn't it also important in that we take responsibility of prejudices we have been cooking? Or can we actually take responsibility and control our wretched selves? Well, we can always start from letting our prejudice affect less of our behavior and actions. But you may ask, how can it be? Well, there are a few arguments that can cover this. Oh, you think you are a self-aware creature and that's why you think that you are entitled to being better than other animals? Then there is your first argument from awareness. It was already covered in bogus pipeline experiments that we could actually be aware of being biased. But oh well, life is not spicy without a little prejudice against the minorities. But actually, being biased and being unconsciously biased is two different things. We cannot be aware of something if we are not aware in the first place. That sounds obvious, but oh well. Let's suppose we observe a Karen who is in a bad mood today because her Subway sandwich had one less sesame seed than usual. Now she might become triggered and start ranting because she has a bad mood, but she does not notice these bad moods of her. So in this situation, is she responsible of her actions when she cannot notice her bad mood? Now that is a debate, isn't it? Actually, no. Karens are blameworthy of whatever they do because if you are always in a bad mood, then you technically cannot be in a bad mood. We are in 2020, aren't we? That's another argument from awareness. With access to realm of information, which this modern world is, we cannot say that we are not aware at all. This is shown in the paper by Washington and Kelly 2016, where they compared two hypothetical egalitarian individuals with similar brain makeup. One is an old school egalitarian from 80s, while the other one is modern egalitarian from 2014. They both judge people out from their resumes and have no idea in hell what is implicit bias. But who is to take more responsibility of their prejudices against people? Well, of course, the latter one, as she lives in an era where the research and knowledge has gone further than ever compared to the 80s. She's out to know about her inherent bias and remain impartial. So the social and epistemic environment one lives in makes one out to be responsible. So we were required to take responsibility through the awareness we have, but similarly, it is also argued that one can take control over this process which makes the belief biased. As implicit bias occurs in the background where the agent's perception is bypassed as mentioned before. Now, if that is the case, cannot we just take the responsibility of such occurrences? It is hard to say so, as our psychological mechanism makes one behave in a specific way when logically it shouldn't be the case. This is the automaticity of human and can be hard to pin down whether it can be controlled. Though it is being argued by many that such isn't the case, as in the paper written by Churchland 2019 talks about a system called ecological control, where one can be programmed to not do the automatic action one was supposed to do. For example, one could take choices which could lead to less exposure to daily stereotypes. How about closing your Instagram for once, instead of making this fake beauty stereotype in your head by watching the overly photoshopped models, if you even can call them models in the first place? While one can try to take the above measures, even then one can come across situations where the individual is not in the immediate control but is held responsible for the automaticity, such as learning a new skill where the muscle memory is automatic, or learning a language. But the argument is that one does not speak Mandarin in one day through willpower, unless you are a self-proclaimed polyglot, but learns it and then the automaticity kicks in. So during that long interval, one can have indirect control to steer the wheel in any direction. Either you let the bias influence you, or say no, I am the in charge today. There are more arguments where one can be said to be held responsible, for example through visualizing one's own deep self. But the idea being abstract over what deep self is makes me not want to explain. Yes, I'm lazy, but you shouldn't be lazy and just press the subscribe. Okay, so we're coming near to the end. I see. Ethics shows us a path over how to solve this major issue of implicit bias, as instead of arguing who should take the responsibility, we can just be good humans and sort the issue out and make world a better place and all that good shiz. There has been a lot of research going around to prevent the initiation of solid set prejudice. One way is to change the general association of one object to another, which sets the basis of implicit bias. An example of association could be a Twitch donation to a female streamer being associated as simping. Actually, that is totally true and I agree with that sentiment. So how can this change-based solution can come into practicality, where interaction between different social and ethnic groups causes the implicit bias to reduce? I mean, that is why if you go outside London, you end up finding pure Wesps who ended up taking UK out of the EU, while in another experimental training of individuals where they are told to press the button no when finding a stereotype consistent images. While when it is a stereotype inconsistent image, they are required to push yes. While other set of solutions come under the category of control-based interventions instead of change, people who supposedly represent themselves as egalitarian can be brought to the realization of how their actual experimentational results were prejudiced, leading to anxiety and discomfort, which could stick as a reminder in the unconscious self, ultimately making the control of their bias easier. Although these type of experiments and trials are still confusing because they also end up changing the association of one object to another. So is this a control-based or change-based solution? And would they actually be effective, as the set of data is limited because most research on these interventions are recent? But at least it is hoped that these solutions can reduce the prejudice in the society. So there is only one big ass problem that make the prejudice and the bias unavoidable, that we are humans. Now that is a pretty obvious statement, you say, but I can discard that comment of us being humans, as we came to know that other animals can be under effect of the implicit bias. But that problem of us being humans ends up actually also being the solution of the problem. The problem is inevitable due to how we are brought up in the society, but that does not stop us to use our big brains to create an environment where empathy, perspective sharing, and exposure to different cultures and social norms can be increased. But how we get to that part of depends on the research done in the coming future. The research on metaphysics can bring light to the question which still remain unanswered, such as, is individuals' behavior a permanent trait or a temporary situational state? Also, whether the phenomena of implicit bias vary from person to person or not. The questions of ethics, of bias and prejudice readily awaits further research over how we can be held morally responsible for the bias we believe. There are many questions on the epistemological frontier as well, such as, if your psychologist tells you that statistically you appear to be biased, then is it justifiable? If you're irritated by this comment and feel entitled to your opinion and just want to take the kids away from the psychologist because he actually was your husband, then it is justifiable. But seriously, how I see prejudice is that we need to be prejudiced against the prejudice itself, or at least train our implicit bias to fight against it, which might ultimately assist in stopping it from becoming a social norm instead. I think someone is knocking my door. Let me check if it's my Amazon delivery.
May I speak to the manager? Are you the manager? I'm a customer and I would like to speak. I don't want to be rude, but you're very disrespectful.